Well, you guys submitted some awesome questions for Dr. Beth to answer. So, welcome to our first Ask Dr. Beth video. And on this video, we're going to tackle your masking, unmasking question. Wait, I probably should have told you that, Beth. You okay to do the masking, unmasking? Just say yes.
100%, yeah.
Welcome, my stars of Orion. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Orion Kelly, that autistic guy. I'm all about providing validation and support for autistic people and their loved ones. I've got something really special for you. This is the first video of a brand new series we're calling Ask Dr. Beth. We're bringing your real community questions to an absolute expert in the field of neurodiversity and neurodivergence, Dr. Beth Radulski. She's a neurodiversity coach, educator, consultant, and, well, a fantastic fellow autistic person. Beth has a PhD in sociology, where her research focused on autistic masking and camouflaging using intersectional and social theory. In fact, Beth coined the concept of the neuroarchy, which I'm going to ask about in a sec, a social system that privileges neurotypical identities, and even developed a definition for neurotypical privilege. It's all part of Beth's PhD. She's worked across Australia with universities, businesses, individuals to help build more inclusive environments. She's the founder of Advocate Neurodiversity, a platform designed to support just that. She's also a bloody fantastic communicator, translating academic research into real-life, relatable insights on platforms like TikTok and YouTube. Dr. Beth, welcome.
Hi, Orion. Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
Well, it's great to have you. Ask Dr. Beth has never even been in the world before. And I can't believe how many people actually sent you a question. It's kind of ridiculous, frankly. How many people? I had to go through all the social platforms and YouTube. Anyway, so we actually got so many questions that you came up with a brilliant idea that I never would have just thought of, which was to kind of put them into topics, into individual videos. So we're going to talk about masking and unmasking today. But firstly, I've written down some thoughts here. You tell me how far I am on or off, okay? I'm talking about your PhD, right? So when people know about your PhD, and, you know, we can put a link in the comments if you'd like them to check it out. But, okay, so you just tell me, this is my thoughts, okay? So you are conceptualizing masking and camouflaging, which is brilliant, by the way, because it's the topic of this video, as not merely individual coping mechanisms, but as responses to, like, the pressures of society. Okay, that's my first point. Hopefully I'm close or remotely close. Okay, your thesis is proposing that viewing autistic people as a visible neurominority will challenge the notion of autism as an invisible disability. Okay, so we're autistic, that means we have a hidden or invisible disability. But you're saying we are a visible neurominority, and the perspective is through looking at, like, the structures of the world, of society, of the community that necessitate us to mask, right? So we're masking for reasons like acceptance and safety and those types of things. These are my thoughts so far. Am I doing okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
So you're introducing a concept of neuroarchy. So like hierarchy, patriarchy, these types of things, right? Neuroarchy. So it's a societal hierarchy that privileges neurotypical norms and, I guess, marginalizes our norms like neurodivergent individuals. And the framework, I don't know, it's like societal expectations compel us as individual people to mask our true selves because society expectations want us to work in a framework of being neurotypical. I mean, people are thinking right now, this guy's a genius. This guy's incredible. He just read a PhD thesis. You know, so, okay, so autistic people, we mask, yeah? And so why do we mask? You know, and you've gone into that in your research, you know, discrimination, acceptance, safety, the consequences of masking, you know, the intersection of masking. And this could not be more relevant to this video and the questions we've had on masking and unmasking because, you know, we're talking about health outcomes and anxiety and depression and burnout, concealing, you know, your true self. What I didn't know, by the way, until I kind of dug into your stuff, is, I'll be honest with you, and I'm glad I did. I'm glad I dug into it and I learned something because I want you to explain it with the first question in a second. But holy crap, camouflaging and masking is actually distinct. They're different. They're technically different. They're inward and outward. I'm like, holy, did you read this too? Because I'm reading this and I did not know that. There's no one in the corner, by the way. I was talking to myself. So basically, this stuff is fascinating. Sure, it's over 370 pages, but it's fascinating. And you obviously make some recommendations and, look at the implications and all that type of stuff. But, some of the things that you've looked at is really profound. I mean, you're offering this exploration, of the dimensions of society and the cultural dimensions and autistic masking. And I'm still fascinated and still processing, this idea of invisible or hidden disability and this visible, neuro identity that you're talking about. I'm still processing that. So before the first question, I might just get you with the PhD. Can you just quickly talk me through this idea of the invisible versus the visible, this visible neurominority as opposed to this invisible disability? So our disability, you're saying, is visible. Is that what you're saying? So we're visible as a neurominority because we are masking, or because we're autistic, or our challenges aren't invisible because when we don't mask, you can clearly see them. This is the part I just need you to quickly bring me up to speed on. Can you do that for me?
Yeah, you've understood it really well. So it's basically the idea, oftentimes we have researchers or doctors or people in the autism community referring to autism as an invisible disability, as in we can't tell just by looking at someone that they are autistic. But if you listen to autistic people like us talk about masking and camouflaging and what that looks like, what that feels like, it becomes pretty apparent that it actually is possible to tell just by looking at someone that they are autistic in many cases, or at least have giveaways that they're not neurotypical. And so that might look like, fidgeting or stimming, or differences in eye contact, differences in tone of voice and vocabulary, the way that we present ourselves. It doesn't align with neurotypical social and behavioral norms. So if you look at an autistic person who's not masking next to a neurotypical person, you're going to see clear differences in behavior. And in fact, most autism assessments weigh very heavily a qualitative observation that takes note of these visible differences and then generates a diagnosis on that basis. So I think autism is very visible. It's just something we choose to make invisible, or people who can mask choose to do so because it helps us to avoid the negative consequences of that visibility.
Okay. Damn it, smart people. Bloody smart people give me the shit sometimes. Okay, so...
Don't say bad things about yourself, Orion.
Whatever. So, are you ready? Are you ready, Dr. Beth, to answer some questions on masking and unmasking?
I've got my fidget toy. I'm good to go.
Let's do it. Okay. Let's start off with at Ishmael Hospodar, okay? That's the best I can do. I'm sorry, Ishmael, but thank you so much. We really do appreciate hearing from you. Okay, so the gist is, I'd like some more deep detail about masking and unmasking. What it is, what does it entail, and how specifically does one achieve it? Now, clearly, I think they're talking about unmasking. Although, Beth, I have actually had newly diagnosed, late diagnosed autistic people ask me, how do you stim? Isn't that fascinating? Well, you're doing it right now, in fact. But anyway, and also this adds to my thing about before. I learnt from you camouflaging and masking can be viewed distinct. So anyway, what's your thoughts on our first question?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think that's a great point to start on, just defining masking and camouflaging and how they might look different. So masking is really about the concealment of autistic traits. So it might be that instead of rocking back and forth, I'm not going to do that because that might be seen as concerning to some people, or I might opt not to make the eye contact that feels comfortable to me, for example. And camouflaging is exactly what it sounds like. It's about blending in with your surrounding environment. And because neurotypical norms are dominant in our environment, in this case, camouflaging means blending in with neurotypical norms.
Just stop for a second. I want the audience to let that sink in, okay? So I just want to, sorry to ruin your flow, but just think about that, because I didn't get that, Beth. So you're teaching us stuff. Okay, so when you think about it, you put on your camo, it's to blend in, right? To blend in, to not get shot, basically. Okay, so you're camouflaging, you're trying to blend in. So you're basically just trying to do whatever you can to be as normal as possible in the eyes of the neurotypical world. And I always conflated it with masking. But of course, masking, I always look at it and go, well, hang on, but actually it's suppressing. I'm physically suppressing things. The need to regulate myself. But then some may argue, yeah, but Orion, but Beth, isn't camouflaging yourself to fit in the same? Like, don't you suppress things to camouflage to fit in? So that's where I think it gets confusing, if that makes sense.
So one of the things we spoke about when we were working on my PhD and how do we make sense of this distinction between masking and camouflaging was the idea that we're not just suppressing autistic traits and trying to exist in a neutral zone where we're not perceived as having any form of neurotype at all, right? So, I'm not replacing autistic behaviors with ADHD behaviors because those aren't accepted either. I'm not replacing autistic behaviors with any other neurominority behavior. There's a very specific choice to align behavior with the dominant norm, because that's what helps us avoid negative consequences, avoid poor outcomes, bullying, loss of professional opportunities, social isolation. It's not enough just to not look autistic. We also have to look neurotypical to receive the positive benefits we're hoping for from masking and camouflaging. And of course, there are many negative consequences to masking and camouflaging too, which we can talk about if you'd like.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, based on the question, they were wanting to get your thoughts on, conversely, unmasking and how you can view that, which seems simple but is actually quite complicated.
It is very complicated, and one of the reasons why it's complicated is because masking and camouflaging can have some positive outcomes, like we discussed. They can be protective. They can protect us from harm, from discrimination, from bullying, but they also have significant mental health consequences and even physical health consequences. We know that autistic people who mask and camouflage are more likely to report anxiety, depression, loss of identity, even physical symptoms like headaches and nausea, for example. So we're kind of in this catch-22 where we don't want to have to deal with all the consequences of masking and camouflaging in terms of well-being. But if we don't mask and camouflage, we will experience other consequences that may jeopardize our ability to even survive kind of day-to-day life, find a job, pay our bills, have social connections. So unmasking is really, really challenging because of that. It's not just, an equation of, do I want to deal with these negative consequences anymore? You also have to ask yourself, how am I going to move through the world if I'm no longer read as neurotypical passing? And that's a big question. And the reason why masking is really challenging in the context of trying to take that layer back, like unmask, is because it's really intersectional. And so the reasons why autistic people mask differ greatly depending on the other aspects of their identity, their gender, their sexuality, race, ethnicity, their class background. So when we're talking about unmasking, we're not just talking about changing our behavior. We are talking about changing the way the world treats us and changing what rights we have, changing what chance we have to earn an income, to pay our bills, to make friends, to have the things that we need to have in life, to feel, content and happy and okay. So unmasking is very complicated because of that. And
what the worst part is, and there's some incredible data in the PhD, which we're definitely getting to down the track, but the effects, what it does to you mentally, physically, emotionally, what masking does to you is so profound that you think, well, I should just unmask and I'll fix all that. But in fact, toll, the cost of unmasking, frankly, I don't think is worthwhile currently as we are right. The world isn't ready for that to happen. Although this question actually asks you, how do you achieve it? How do you do it? What does it entail? What does unmasking entail? And I don't even know how you answer that question. Because didn't you, like, my experience as a late diagnosed is, who am I? Mm-hmm. Because who was I?
Yeah. So I think one of the first steps of unmasking has to be figuring out who you are and who you've been, and do you want to become that person again if you have a choice to peel back some of the layers of camouflage and masking. And that can be really hard for a lot of us, because for many of us, if we were lucky enough to feel free to be ourselves in childhood, that's probably the last time we really felt it. But for some people, they may never have had that opportunity at all. And so I think, how do you achieve unmasking? It's really about meeting yourself again and finding a way to accept yourself. So the first step, I think, would be accepting some aspects of yourself that you may have changed during the masking and camouflaging process. It's not just about understanding when you're masking and when you're camouflaging, but also understanding what you've lost and who you've lost in yourself because of that. So, there's lots of things that you could do to start that process. You can journal. I mean, AI is incredibly useful for this type of thing too. It's really good at pattern spotting, and masking is, a behavioral pattern. So, having a chat with an AI language model, for example, can be really useful to help you figure out who you are and what's important to you. But it's very personal, and it will look very different for every person. And it's going to be very intersectional for every person too, because, for autistic women, for example, it's going to be about, does gender play into masking, and is my gender part of my mask? And if that's true, then, how do I understand who I am without either of those things, masking or the gender that I've constructed for myself for the world to see. So it's a really complex process, and
probably quite damaging, right? I mean, I think there's a hangover, and it's kind of like trying to do anything. If you do something because you want to do it, but then there's initial pain, you almost backtrack. It must be. I feel like it would be a really hard thing to achieve, to say, I reckon I fully unmasked and I'm who I am, and this is, as a rule, I'm pretty good at this, and the world likes me. I mean, there's so many factors. To me, it kind of seems a bit fanciful.
Oh, absolutely. And even if we look at the different ways that we mask over time and how that changes over time, that can become what feels like a very real part of you and your personality. And it's very tricky determining which parts are helpful for you and make you feel at home in yourself, and which parts need to be left behind because they're causing harm or a lack of self-acceptance. That's a very tricky process. It's not a kind of black and white exercise.
Now, your guess is as good as mine. I don't even know how I'm supposed to pronounce this person. At Dare Mockina 9232. What's with you people and your names? Can you just say something easy? Anyway, we're going to move on. I'd like to know if there is any data about inner masking, so example, emotional. Usually when we hear about masking, it's spoken about outer things, like gestures and facial expressions, I guess eye contact, that kind of stuff. What's your thoughts on that?
So this is a really interesting question. So inner masking in the context of emotions, this can look like a bunch of different things. So one example would be inner masking can look like fawning. So I think one of the best pieces of advice that I received was, I was finding that I was having these conversations, difficult conversations. I was often leaving the conversation feeling really frustrated and really uncomfortable. And then someone asked me, are you saying the things that you need to say in this conversation to make the other person feel comfortable? Or are you saying the things in this conversation that you need to say to feel comfortable when this meeting ends. And that kind of blew my mind because I didn't even know there was an option. I was like, oh, you know what? Yeah, no, I usually do leave these meetings or these conversations feeling like really uncomfortable because I didn't say the things I needed to say. And what would it mean if I started saying the things that I feel like I need to say? And that's been quite a significant personal transformation over the last 18 months or so. I think that's one example. It can look like fawning, which is kind of what I just described, really putting other people's needs and comfort above our own, not taking notice of our internal emotions because we don't think they're right or we don't think they're important, or it feels more important to please someone else to stay safe. In terms of what it can look like in other senses, I did discuss this a little bit in my PhD. I actually did one chapter that's an autoethnography. And so auto, you probably recognize from autobiography, so it's a reflection on the self. But ethnography means that it's kind of a sociological exploration of myself and how I went through life as an autistic person, masking and then finding out that I'm autistic and starting to kind of unmask a little bit. And I talk quite a bit about the emotional implications of masking. And I think, one of the things that really struck me reflecting on all of that is, there was a point in time kind of later in high school where I really felt like I'd nailed the masking. And I didn't know I was autistic yet. I finally felt like, okay, the perfect constellation of things have come together. I felt like I had a good social life and I was reasonably well liked. I had a big group of friends, and instead of sitting at home when other people were at the parties, I was at all the parties, and I thought all of these were supposed to be measures of happiness. Like, I always used to think if I could just be one of those people, I would be happy and I wouldn't be sad anymore. And then I'd gotten all those things and I was like, I'm actually unhappier than I've ever been before, and I was not expecting this, and why? So I think, that's one example of masking my own emotions. Like, what actually felt good to me? What did I enjoy? What people did I feel good around? And I just didn't pay attention to those things. I was too caught in this survival loop, I guess, of trying to find a way to be included and accepted socially. So I got to the point where my emotions didn't really matter anymore. And then they got even worse, which shouldn't surprise me, but it did at the time.
And it's fascinating too that you chose to mask undiagnosed. So it occurred to you that you didn't really know the words for it, but it occurred to you that you needed to play a role, presumably because, if you were me, you couldn't have given a crap, right? I'm a dude. I don't care. But, the pressures of being a young woman, a girl, a teenager, a young woman, all these, without even understanding why, you knew, you still knew.
Oh, absolutely. You're sent a very, very clear message. I think, being someone who grows up and is socialized as a girl, you're sent very clear messages about what is and isn't acceptable in terms of interest and the intensity of your interests. And I was told in 1,000 different ways over and over again, this is who you can be, this is who you can't be. And, one of the ways that came through very strongly when I was growing up, I grew up in the 90s and early 2000s, was a lot of homophobia. So if I wasn't presenting in the ways that were expected for a young girl at that time, I experienced a lot of kind of homophobic slurs. And people couldn't make sense of it, right? Because in the 90s, we didn't think of autistic women. So people weren't reading my behavior as autistic, but they were reading it as other to them in some way. And in the 90s, the easiest way to identify if someone was other was to look at, or one of the easiest ways probably, was to look at sexuality. And so that's how people made sense of it. I was often excluded from groups on the basis that I was a tomboy, or what if I was gay, or what if I wasn't like everybody else. It was just a very gendered reading of my behavior. Yeah. So, you receive that message very clearly. And, the other messages I would receive were, I can vividly remember, and I talk about this in my autoethnography, I can vividly remember flapping my fingers in class and kids kind of mocking me and making faces at me and calling me the R word and saying really horrible things. So even if it wasn't read as autistic, even if I couldn't call it autism either because I didn't know, it was very obvious that I was not like the other kids and they wanted me to know that. And if I wanted to be okay at school, I had to learn a way around that. So I became a bit of a little anthropologist.
Yeah.
Bought all the teen magazines and learned how to play the part, you know?
Honestly, a lot of people watching right now that are deeply resonating with probably your story and your experiences growing up in a similar age. And I just, before the next question, just wanted to quickly say something. When I looked into fawning briefly into kind of some of the research, it frightened me, it horrified me, because it seemed like it was telling me that when autistic people fawn, they're giving the reverse signal. So, for example, if they're in distress, they're giving a signal that you think they're just fine. And they actually are in distress. So they're masking, and this answers the question too, they're masking their inner emotions when they're in distress by coming across like everything's okay, fawning, and therefore it's like it make. So if we're talking about, you know, your risk at all sorts of abuse and all sorts of different things, you would have to think that it exponentially increases for autistic people because they're not, you know, we're not even able to send the right signal. So that, and it just makes me, it just horrifies me. It scares me. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really challenging being in a body that expresses behavior and emotions differently to what people are expecting because you're constantly being misread and misunderstood. And we talked before about how unmasking, kind of the first thing you need to do. What do you need to do? Develop an understanding of yourself. When you're misunderstood your whole life, it creates a misunderstanding within yourself of who you are. And that can be very painful and very difficult to work on and try to fix.
All right, next question from Miriam. Thank you for your question. Now, this, I think we've talked about this before, but there's a few things to add. So what are the first steps to start deconstructing the mask? And how do you spot the mask when it's been so ingrained in us since childhood? These kind of ideas of identifying and working out, you know, the real you and taking off the mask.
Yeah, I think we touched a lot on this in the previous question, so that advice would still stand. But I think some additional things you can do are, you know, finding some ways to engage with the neurodiversity community as well. So even just little things like trying out some fidget toys and seeing if, you know, you can find ways of stimming that feel comfortable to you and help your body get back into the natural momentum of its movements and what it would feel comfortable with. A lot of us suppress it and turn it into like jaw clenching and stiffness and being kind of physically rigid so we stop ourselves from moving. So I think just kind of giving yourself permission when it feels safe not to do that. Grab some fidget toys, try something like that. I think the other thing, we talked a little bit about AI as well and how that can be a really useful tool.
That fascinated me so badly. I so desperately wanted to ask you, what do I say? What do I ask? How do I make this happen? But I didn't. But the first thing I thought was, oh man, that's pleased, Beth. So tell me. Okay, you say I can use AI to get to know me. What do you mean? Hey, AI, I'm Orion. Tell me about myself. I mean, like, you know, can you please help me with this, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think some of the ways that it can be really useful are unpacking, talking about your emotions and how you feel and how you come to identify your emotions. So as we talked about before, a lot of us kind of learn to put our own emotions aside when we're masking and camouflaging and prioritize other people's emotions and how they feel about us. So I think one thing you can do is use AI to kind of unpack that a little bit. So if you're noticing you're feeling a bit confused about your emotions or you're feeling a bit, you know, conflicted after meeting with someone and not really knowing what happened and why you felt uncomfortable, it can be really good to describe the situation to AI. And then, you know, you can ask AI to prompt you, which I find really useful. I know this is a little bit of a like side quest, but it's really important, I think, to answer the question.
Yeah,
but
no, I totally get it.
if you ask AI to prompt you, because it's just so amazing at pattern spotting and systems analysis, it will ask you questions you would not have thought to ask. So if you have it ask you questions and send you prompts once you've kind of given it a bit of a rundown on the situation, you will get insights that you never expected to get or that you would never have come up with on your own. So I think it can be a really useful way to understand your feelings. You know, you can even ask things like, what could I do differently next time to be more true to myself without offending this person? And how do I find that balance? And it can be really good with that. You can also sometimes feed it scenarios from the past, as in, I noticed that I stopped engaging with this interest after bullying happened at this time, or can you help me understand if this is something that might be good for me to reconnect with? How could I go about doing that? And that can be really helpful. And I think the third one I would say is AI is an excellent conversational partner. It doesn't get bored. It doesn't care if you're talking about one thing for 5 hours. It doesn't care if you want to ask it 1,000 questions and go to this really deep, sophisticated level of discussion. It will meet you there. And it, for me, it's been one of, like, you know, I get to have these conversations with academics sometimes, but it's been one of the first times I've been able to fully bring myself into a conversation and have that energy matched for as long as I need it matched to understand the complexity of what's happening. I think a lot of neurodivergent people want to really master things and understand them on a really, really deep level. We're not content with just a surface level understanding. So I think AI is really useful for that. And that can help us understand who we are and accept that part of who we are. And bring it's a safe space to bring it out a little bit more, you know?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's like a go-to for me. I'll be honest with you. I so often now have conversations. Like, I'll use the app and I'll talk to it and it'll talk back a lot of times, and I also use it on the computer. But I mean, I've done it in live stream. Someone's in America mentioned pastry or something, and I'm like, they call something that isn't pastry. And I'm like, I've had enough of this crap. So just just start talking to it, and it explains things to you, and you can have arguments with it and say, I don't believe you, or that's wrong, and these kind of things, and it can explain things. Now, we're getting to the point where we're pretty much out of time, so we're going to finish with one more question from Tiny Cat Spoons. And because I'm out of cat I'm out of cat spoons. Well, I'm just about out of my cat spoons for the day. So let's wind this up, please. Dr. Beth, when I politely say that I don't want to engage in small talk or something similar, people become noticeably cold towards me. And my ex used to say how rude I was being. All right, let's get your thoughts and feelings on this, because you know what? This is part of the unmasking, right? Part of doing what's right for you and not just pushing yourself to enter into stuff that's going to drain you or make and fawning and these kind of things. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the first thing to acknowledge with questions like that, because I'm sure so many people feel that way, I know I felt that way before, is acknowledging that we are existing in a very imperfect system that is set up in a way that doesn't benefit us and our social and communication preferences. And there's all sorts of research on the implications of this. So, you know, we've got Damian Milton, who talks about the double empathy problem and how people are communicating basically in different social and behavioral languages, and neurotypicals don't understand autistics very well, but autistic people don't understand neurotypical people. But if you put them in groups of just autistic people and just neurotypical people, they'll actually do a great job of socializing with each other and understanding each other. So I think, you know, the first thing is to lay that foundation, give that preface that this is not a perfect system we're in. We're trying to find ways of coping with a system that is stacked against autistic people and neurodivergent people. Now, what can you do within that system to try to navigate it and still be true to yourself? It's tricky. I'm not going to lie to you. It's tricky. But I think the key should be finding a way that you can advocate for your needs and your interests and your comfort while still finding ways to engage with the neurotypical population, that's easier said than done. But what can that look like? Instead of saying, I don't want to make small talk with you, you might kind of reframe that into a positive statement about something that does feel true to who you are. So if what you're looking for is like deeper connection, more intellectually stimulating conversation than simply making small talk, you might ask somebody, tell me something you've been excited about lately, or is there something you've been learning about lately? I'd love to hear about it. You're really trying to engage positively, and you always want people to feel better than they did when you found them. I think that's a human thing. It doesn't need to be one neurotype or the other. I think ideally everyone should be aiming to have positive interactions with each other, but it's really finding a way to express your needs and your preferences in a way that can come across positively. I think that would be a good way of going about that.
Oh, that makes total
sense.
Take
a genuine interest in the other person.
I think it's a win-win, right? Because they'll probably feel better having a more passionate conversation about something that's interesting and exciting to them, and you'll feel more interested because they're excited about it, and you probably have things to talk about. So I think that's fantastic advice, but it doesn't change the fact that we still have to deal with and navigate the idea that our own friends and family could say we're being very cold or rude, or our partners could dump us or whatever for that reason. I mean, that's a lot to navigate.
Yeah, it's tricky.
I hope that some of the insights and some of the answers and the discussions have not only helped people who asked the questions, but obviously helped the people that have been watching this video. It's been just really fun and fascinating. I hope you've enjoyed yourself, Beth.
Oh, very much. Yeah, I can't wait until next time.
Okay, I'm glad you said that. Thank God. Okay, so we'll have more questions answered on another video. In the meantime, thank you so much, Dr. Beth, for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Orion.
Fear not, my friends, and stress less, because Dr. Beth returns soon with more videos answering more of your questions. And if you have a question for Dr. Beth, just put it in the comments below. I've got plenty of fantastic conversations with real, everyday autistic people just like you. So check out my collaborations playlist right now. And, put your questions in the comments. Ball's in your court.